You're listening to a CNA podcast.
It's official, Trump 2.0 has begun. And in the climate space, well, a lot has happened already. The US is leaving the Paris Agreement. Again, the country's energy system, its offshore wind developments, and its policies on electric vehicles were once more all left at the mercy of the president's pen. Today we look at what's left and what it all means for America and the world. Hi and welcome to Climate Conversations. I'm Jack Board.
Hi Jack, Liling Tan here. Hello everybody.
How are you this week?
I'm good. Recovering from the whiplash of Trump's new America. What about you? How you doing?
I'm good. Watching from afar. Feel like reality TV has re-emerged in the White House. So that's been curious to observe from a distance. What was your hot take on the manner in which Donald Trump, quite theatrically delivered his flurry of executive orders last week, and then specifically many of them targeting environmental policy? Like, it was all so dramatic and almost light-hearted, yet so consequential as well.
Well, he's always been quite the showman, right? So, even though a lot of his moves around climate and energy policy were expected, he had made these threats for some time. I was really quite struck by the speed and ferocity in how he delivered them and followed through on these threats.
Yeah, it was like, gone, gone, gone.
It's a bit shock and awe, and it does get people worked up about his changes. I mean, you can hear the applause and the cheers after practically every sentence, right?
It certainly does seem like another pivotal moment in America's relationship with climate action and with the rest of the world. Plenty of worries, I guess, from the global community, and we'll unpack all of that later. But first, today's quiz. Who's excited? Hands up if you're excited. I don't see any hands.
All right. Okay. I'm
excited.
All right.
So the US getting out of the Paris Agreement. Now, Liling, you're across all of these multilateral agreements and frameworks. You know them word by word. Can you tell me?
You think too highly of me, but yes, go on.
Can you tell me which other countries are also not signatories to Paris? You can tell me how many countries there are and which ones they are. No Googling allowed.
I'll give you my answers at the end of this podcast. For you listeners, you can put down what you think the answers are, put them down in the comments section and see if you get them right as well.
Now, for our main story this week.
I'm immediately withdrawing from the unfair, one-sided Paris Climate Accord ripoff.
Those were the sounds from last week as Donald Trump issued dozens of executive orders and notably ended America's time again within the Paris Agreement. That was the headline moment amid a flurry of changes to the country's environmental and energy policies. Now, this won't just impact the US, but the entire world. As the world's second largest polluter and largest economy, the US has much influence over the global agenda, and all signs point to these moves jeopardizing climate action globally. Now, to unpack some of these key moves, we've brought in someone who's been following this even more closely than we have.
Alexander Kaufman, veteran energy and climate reporter at HuffPost and author of the children's book Earth's Aquarium. So he's fluent in climate speak for both tiny humans and jaded grown-ups.
Alex, thanks for staying up late for us over there. Welcome to Climate Conversations.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, guys.
Now, you've done a pretty great piece, I think, looking at the day one orders that President Trump has made related to climate and energy policy. We're going to go through some of those with you shortly. But first, just your snap reaction to the manner in which Trump has seemingly upended a lot of policy in such a short time already.
So if you'll recall in 2017, perhaps the biggest headline piece out of the climate executive orders he has now is the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. That was a painstakingly long months of almost reality TV-like suspense and debate back in 2017. This time, he began the process straight out the gate. Unlike the last time when it took 3 years and it was only basically completing the process under the UN, this time it'll take just one. So he's really wasting no time, and time is already on his side with this.
So, Alex, as one of the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitters, what would America leaving the pact actually mean for the country and the broader climate fight around the world?
Well, notably, the United States is not currently the largest annual emitter. That position is held by China, but it is the largest cumulative emitter. And what's so important about this is, of course, carbon dioxide remains in the atmosphere for centuries and centuries. So the emissions that we were spewing from our coal plants and factories and the destruction of our forests throughout the 19th century, when we were growing rather wealthy, are indeed a major driving force behind the warming that we're experiencing today. Now, I say this not just to identify perhaps the hole in the argument that you hear from the administration or from some of the president's supporters, but to note the importance of America's role within this agreement. America's presence in it is not only critical because of the expectation that a nation that grew as rich by emitting all of that carbon in the first place would play an important financial role in inviting some other developing countries to skip the coal or wood heavy phase of economic development and choose a cleaner path as they lift their populations out of poverty. But what motivation is there to do that at all if there is no clear cut expectation that the second largest emitter, with some of the highest living standards and certainly some of the highest per capita emissions, right, is not participating in this? So I think above all, it just is perhaps a very cynical first step toward the crumbling of these hard-fought negotiations that we've been striving for literally my entire life. I'm 33 years old, and some of the earliest gatherings like this were taking place in Rio in 1992. And, now we are likely to see a pretty significant unraveling and a lot of other countries dialing back some of their ambition, because if the United States isn't doing its part, then why should they?
And Alex, you wrote about Trump halting foreign aid because of this withdrawal from the Paris Agreement. What do you see as the implications of this missing American money in the system now when so much of the world is demanding it?
I think that this will ultimately really open the door for a lot of other countries that have really stepped up when the United States and the West more broadly have failed to deliver on these things. In the Paris Agreement was for there to be a $100 billion green climate fund to help many of these developing countries to both adapt to the climate change that they've done little to contribute to, and to adopt some of these other cleaner forms of energy so that they would forego more coal plants. And it took basically until last year for all those rich nations to actually put together the money that they had pledged to give. And so this was already an issue. And I think this really opens the door for some of these emerging powers, certainly within the BRICS bloc that we now see forming, be them Saudi Arabia, China, India, to really step in and perhaps wield a lot more influence over how these countries develop and deal with this issue, and perhaps leave America somewhat in the dark. I would say that, there are certain things that are lost within the liberal order and the influence that the United States has been able to have over certain things that we won't be able to get back.
When Donald Trump first withdrew from the Paris climate deal in his first term, it was a very different energy climate, different energy landscape then. And now, given all the investments and the developments in renewable alternative energy, a lot of people are saying that the ship has sailed and that what Trump is doing is trying to hold back something that he really doesn't have as much control as he did when he first became president, right?
I think that's quite right. And I think a way to read some of the other orders that he has here, particularly with the national energy emergency that he has declared in another one, is to say that perhaps he is accepting that reality and simply looking for very straightforward economic opportunities for the United States within that framework without much concern for the overall emissions. He has certainly gone after wind energy very aggressively and certainly doesn't seem to see a future for the United States exporters of wind turbines to other places. Solar has managed to sort of skate by with very little mention in a lot of these things, but they are putting a particular focus on technologies like nuclear energy. They have certainly opened the door to doing a lot more mining of the critical minerals that are considered necessary for battery production and other things like this. So they certainly see plenty of opportunities, clearly, in the documents that have been laid out in this energy transition that's already happening. The real question is how much they want happening within the United States and what types of technologies they're comfortable trying to foster with the federal government's blessing.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about energy then, and about this Unleashing American Energy Order. What a name, right? And a lot of impacts. So let's talk through what this order means. I think top of the agenda is that it's going to check a lot of the spending as part of Joe Biden's landmark industrial policy, which was the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA. So the IRA is basically hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies, tax credits, to turbocharge a whole host of clean industries around the country. Trump has ordered an immediate pause in the disbursement of these funds, and as we've discussed many times, though, the IRA will be quite difficult to unwind. A lot of these projects are well underway. They're also being implemented in red states. His executive order goes further to assist domestic energy resources: oil, natural gas, coal, hydropower, and critical minerals, like you mentioned. Another reminder, though, that oil and gas production did reach new peaks under Biden, so these industries have been doing just fine as it is, but seemingly now there will be fewer barriers to their production, expansion, exports, consumption. It obviously hurts emissions targets for the world overall and emboldens other countries to continue investing and using their own dirty energy fleets. And LNG, for example, is a big issue throughout Southeast Asia, and that could continue to expand. And Alex, you did mention this kind of energy emergency that was declared by the president for the first time in the US. Why did he do that?
That's correct. So the reasons why he did it are, there's a few different ways to read this. I mean, the people around the president were quite frustrated by the degree to which his desires and policy imperatives were thwarted by the deep state, as he calls it, really the large federal bureaucracy that exists across administrations, is nonpartisan, and has fostered a lot of the excellent scientific research that has, for example, proven the reality of climate change over and over again and made that data available. Part of the appeal, then, of declaring an emergency like this is that it offers his agencies and members of his government far greater latitude to act in ways that would be in violation of different legal restrictions under ordinary conditions. So that's the first thing. The second thing to consider is that there is indeed a mounting problem in the United States, and perhaps this is one area where Trump may have a point, which is that we have had worsening blackouts over the last 13 years. The duration of blackouts has nearly doubled, meaning the amount of time that Americans are spending each year disconnected from the grid involuntarily. And part of what has driven that is indeed the effects of climate change, this extreme weather that is motivating massive surges of demand from air conditioning and a lot of stress on aging equipment that we have done very little to maintain compared to other countries. The actual amount of demand that we are expecting to see rise in the years to come. So we are looking at electricity shortages right now. We're experiencing one to some degree right now in New York State. We have freezing temperatures from a polar vortex. As a result of that, we are seeing less electricity in New York when it's being demanded to run electric heat. And we are desperately trying to find some kind of way to bring that, more electricity down, perhaps from Quebec, where we typically import it, but we can't. So instead, if you look at charts of electricity prices across the New York grid today and tonight, they are as high as they can possibly go.
I think the last part that is worth discussing is about EVs. Now, we did a dedicated episode quite recently about EV policy in Asia, and then part of that was how the US plays a role in the momentum of the industry. I think it's fair to say, though, that they haven't taken off in a big way across the states compared to other parts of the world. So Trump, in an executive order, I think is basically saying he's going to go after them, signaling support for conventional vehicles, threatening to remove tax credits for people who buy EVs, seemingly potentially reviewing tailpipe emission standards. You also have Elon Musk, who's there, who's so close to the administration. An interesting dynamic, I think. Alex, I'm not sure if you are an EV driver in New York, but would you hesitate to buy one now, given the turbulence, the ecosystem?
I'm not an EV driver, partly because they've been rather expensive as new cars to buy. We have not been able to avail ourselves of some of those really beautiful and flashy, cheap Chinese EVs. But moreover, the real reason is that the infrastructure has not been built out. So infamously, there were billions of dollars promulgated under the laws that Biden passed to build out charging networks, and fewer than 100 of these stations were built by the time he left office. This is simply moving too slowly, and America is a vast nation that unfortunately has, with the exception of the city I live in, quite limited public transit options. So for the average American car buyer, they want something that they can trust is going to get them from point A to point B. And if they have to drive from New York City to Boston or from New York City to Chicago, that they will be able to do so with ease and not risk breaking down. And what ended up happening with the tax credits that the Biden administration enacted is that they were overwhelmingly used by much wealthier Americans who were buying a second or a third car. This created a really unfortunate political dynamic that made it easy to paint these EV tax credits as a tax handout to the people who need it the least. So some of the ways in which he will try to roll back these things are not going to be easy to do overnight. So Elon Musk, who has been able to sell a luxury product and get a lot of his vehicles on the road through the sheer might of the brand that he's built, doesn't see much of a reason to maintain these tax incentives. It hasn't done much to necessarily drive his sales, and it would seem like to see some of his competitors thwarted in their efforts to compete with him directly.
As we've spoken about before, it is China who is the global leader in the EV space by a long way. And so what it does and how importing markets behave in response, I think, would do more for this technology than what Trump does, at least from an international perspective. All right, Alex, great to speak with you. We'll be keenly watching your reporting on HuffPost over the next few years. I'm sure you'll be a busy man.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to be on.
Now it's weather time, Liling. Air pollution here. Big sigh from me. What's on your radar?
All right, Jack, we're looking at cloudy with a chance of more rain ahead. You and I, we can look forward to this cooler weather that's been hanging around for the past few weeks. That will continue for a little bit longer, several weeks, perhaps even months. And the rain will also stick around in some parts of the region. And that's as La Nina, the weather phenomenon, La Nina, sets in later than usual and sticks around until about April. So we will get a little bit wetter than usual, cloudier than usual, but it'll be less crazy than your average La Nina season.
Okay, thanks for the weather update. Let's go back to our quiz question. Repeating it for you, can you tell me which other countries are also not signatories to Paris alongside the US when it formally exits in probably about 1 year's time?
So the first one I'm going to go with is Iran. So we know Iran isn't part of the Paris climate deal, and that's largely because of U.S. sanctions. So these sanctions have been in place, and they've limited or severely restricted Iran's ability to transition away from its domestic oil and gas production and also to invest in clean energy. So my second answer is Libya. I remember it was planning to ratify a few years ago, but I don't think it did. I'm not sure why. And the last one, of course, is Yemen, which is still embroiled in civil war. So I expect that climate isn't a priority for them now. Did I get them all right?
Do you get bonus points for all of the context as well?
Woohoo!
Perfect score. Yeah. Iran, Libya, and Yemen.
Second week in a row.
Yeah. So I think it does stand out that, most of these countries are doing it because of sanctions in the case of Iran, but the others not having the institutional capacity to do so because of war, political instability, famine. So it's the US almost alone now in not being part of this process because of ideology. So, okay, that's it for this episode of Climate Conversations. Thanks as always for joining us, and we'll be back next week.
I'm Liling Tan. Bye for now. And for those of you marking the Lunar New Year, here's wishing you all a healthy, happy, and prosperous Year of the Snake.
And I'm Jack Board. Thanks as always to the team that put together this podcast: Arjun Bala, Saye Win, Tiffany Ung, Janani Jahari, and Crispina Roberts.